Hello, and welcome to my disease report for Dr. Cody's microbiology class. I'm presenting on guinea worm disease, the scientific name for which is dracunculiasis. This disease has a long and interesting history. It has been around for many thousands of years. It's first referenced in the Old Testament and ancient poetry by Galen, who was a Greek poet, and it's diagnosed as early as the 9th century AD by Arab-Persian physicians Brazos and Avicenna. It's also very, very common in ancient Egypt. So they found multiple calcified remains of these worms in mummies, which is really cool. In the 18th century, there were different opinions on what was emerging from the sores that were on people's limbs. Some people thought it was exposed nerves, and other people thought it was dead tissue. But Carl Linnaeus suggested that it's actually a worm. So he was right, and the infectious agent is called guinea worm because travelers observed prevalence in the Gulf of Guinea when they went there. In 1870, the role of the intermediary host in the transmission of this disease was determined by Mr. Fedchenko, who was a Russian naturalist. In 1905 and 1913, two different scientists figured out the life cycle of the worm, and by the end of the 19th century, there was pretty good public awareness of transmission, and preventative measures were being taken and advertised to prevent the disease. In 1931, from 1926 to 1931, the disease was eliminated from Uzbekistan, and there has been no resurgence since 1932. This was the first country to do so. And then in 1972, Iran also eliminated the disease. In 1984, in 1989, and 1981, 3 different states in India did the same. So as for the taxonomy of this disease, it falls under the kingdom of Animalia. It's in the phylum of Nematoda, which is the roundworms. And if you skip down to the family, it is Dracunculidae. These are the largest of the roundworms. And below that is the genus, Dracunculus, and the species is Dracunculus medinensis, which is actually the largest of those Dracunculidae. As for the characteristics of our worm, its physical appearance is that it is long and white. It's longer than a meter very often in length, as for the females, that is. The males are much smaller. And it's 1 to 2 millimeters thick. Also, most of the female body is composed of the uterus because it can carry up to 3 million embryos at once, which is a lot. Okay, so when it develops, these larvae come out of the worm, which is already in an infected human host, and they go in water, and they are consumed by a copepod. Now, this copepod is a tiny little water flea, and you may be able to see right in here, the worm is all curled up inside that. So after it's been eaten by the copepod, that copepod can be drunk in water because it's really, really small and you can't see it, into a human host. After which the copepod is broken down by the human host digestive system, but the worm survives. So it goes into the small intestine, breaks through the wall, and goes to connective tissue for 60 to 100 days. Then it mates, and the male dies because it's fertilized the female, it's done. So it dies, and the female matures for about a year. Then it moves to the skin, and it carries with it 3 million embryos. So we've talked a little about reproduction already, but in case it wasn't clear, it's sexual reproduction. It's just one-on-one, and they mate in the walls of the abdomen and thorax. There's no social reproductive structure or like a mate picking system because of the short male lifespan. And then the mature female emerges after 10 to 14 months, carrying 3 million embryos. She releases about 100,000 of these stage 1 larvae into the water every time, and there isn't any parental involvement after the release. The larvae have to find the copepods on their own. The lifespan of this worm is about 2 years in the wild, 1.5 in captivity, 3 days outside a cyclops or the copepod, and 1 year in a human host, maybe a little more after it emerges. As for its behavior, it is parasitic and motile and solitary. So parasitic means that it feeds off of another host. Motile means it moves on its own, and solitary means that it kind of does its own thing. Like it's not a colony of worms. So one example of that is that the female burrows to the lower extremities to kind of move out to the outside of the body and release the larvae. So these worms, they don't have any audio or visual senses, but they are alerted by differences in pressure and temperature, which is why when a victim puts their foot in water or any part of their body that's infected, the worm senses that and it releases, it's triggered and it releases the larvae into the water. So as for habitat, it really likes warm, stagnant fresh water. So as you see in the picture here, this boy is pulling water from what looks to be warm and stagnant and fresh. So this is a great place for these worms to live, and he should not be drinking that water without boiling it. As for food habits, it is a carnivorous parasite, so it feeds on the internal tissues of the host itself. And it doesn't have any known predators, but it is a predator itself because it goes after the fleas and it goes after the human host. As for symptoms and signs, this disease is asymptomatic for the first year, so you don't notice anything until the worm makes its way to the surface and gets ready to release the larvae into the wild. So when it makes its way up to the surface, it releases a lot of acid, kind of to break down the skin and make it easier to get out. And that acid, plus the antigens on the worm, they cause a lot of problems. So you get a slight fever, you get an itchy rash, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. And there's also that blister, because the skin is getting messed up and it's painful. So that blister turns into an ulcer, so an open sore, and then the worm starts to come out, which is the hallmark symptom of this disease. Of course, that acid is literally burning your skin, so you get burning pain, and victims will put the infected area in water. But as we said, that triggers the worm to release more larvae into the water, which is how the disease spreads. So that's really bad. Also, of course, it's very important to get this out, but it can cause a severe allergic reaction if the worm is broken and the antigens inside touch your body. So when that happens, you can go into anaphylactic shock and you can die. So obviously you have to be really careful, which is what this guy over here is doing. He's being very gentle. You can also get a secondary bacterial infection in about half of cases, just because there's an open wound and the track that the worm has been on could have other stuff on it. And then you can get chronic joint pain because when the worms go to mature, they often hang out in the connective tissues. All right, so risk factors. Obviously, drinking contaminated water, which is where the copepods and the larvae are. So there's a big push to, provide clean water for people. It also has seasonal prevalence. So if you live in a dry region, you tend to contract guinea worm disease in rainy seasons when there is more water around, and it's not sinking into the ground. It's just kind of stagnant. If you live in a wet region, it tends to happen in dry seasons because there is less water. It's not moving as much, and there's just more stagnant water. Males and females contract it equally. There's no difference between the sexes. But those people that are from ages 15 to 45, so the people that are most likely to be working and out and about, they are the most likely to get it. So, they are often given extra tools like filters to help keep them safe. People that are living in poorer areas are much more likely to contract this disease because the water supply is probably not as clean as it might be in more socioeconomically wealthy areas. The largest risk factor, actually, is contracting the disease in previous years, because if you live in an area where you've had it before, you're likely to have it again. They've actually seen this in different parts of Africa, where there are specific villages I think it was in Chad, where it happens again and again every year, but not like around that area. So it's very specific to one area. The people that are there have had it multiple times. As for societal and cultural impact, the physical problems for the host include severe and often paralyzing pain, temporary paralysis, and up to 3 months of bedriddenness. So this is bad enough for an individual, but when it happens to an entire family or a working community, it really, really cripples them. They are able to do very little. So this has, obviously, economic impact. If your working community isn't working because they can't, then your businesses and farms are not cared for, tended, and you don't have very many profits or produce. And this obviously, it leads to diminished profits if you don't have the things you're supposed to be providing. So that's really bad. And for example, Nigeria lost $20 million in 2008 because of guinea worm disease. So eradicating this disease would be really good for the economies of a lot of different communities. It also has an educational impact. Many children with ill parents work in their place and have to miss school, or just miss school because they themselves are ill, which harms their future as well-equipped members of society. I found it really interesting. In some places, guinea worm disease is actually viewed as innate to human anatomy. It's not seen as like a invader. It's just kind of part of the body, and it will eventually, kind of stand up. They say, and so it's been interesting for people that come in. It's a very different cultural way of looking at things, um, and they have to, figure out how to handle this in a way that's sensitive to the culture and acknowledges their way of looking at it, but also like brings to light, like it would be good if you took care of this because it's, really bad for your body. And then we come to prevention. So there are 4 different things that have to happen for prevention to be very effective. You have surveillance and case containment. So a contained case, they say, is when the victim has been identified within 24 hours of the worm emerging. There's no water contaminated by that particular wound. The wound is properly cared for and health education is provided to the person. They also worry about the provision of safe drinking water. They need protected wells, so like where the water can't go back into the wells if it's been contaminated. Fine mesh for filtering the copepods out of water, because then you don't get the larvae either. And tube straws. So these tube straws, as you can see, this woman is drinking straight out of the water, but she is safe because it's really good at filtering it, and that is great. They are inexpensive to make, and they are quite portable, so it's a great solution. They also do vector control, so that is killing the larvae before they are able to get into the copepods, or after they have gotten into the copepods, and then they can infect humans. There's also health education and community mobilization. So they teach communities about disease and transmission. They help villages to take action by making sure they don't contaminate more water and helping to provide them with clean water. And they explain the need for safe chemical larvicides in the water. So, just kind of reassuring them that it's okay to use the chemicals, even though that can be a little bit daunting. Treatment is quite simple. You have to do it carefully, but it doesn't require any special medication, which is good because then you can train people how to do it on the ground level, and you don't have to have people come in with extra training. So there are 7 steps. You put the affected area in water because the worm likes to come out in water. So you're encouraging it to come out, and then you clean the wound, and you kind of gently pull on the worm until you have resistance, and at that point you stop, because if you break it, you get a really bad allergic reaction. This stage lasts for several weeks. They just come in a little bit every day, and they have it twisted around a stick, as you can see right here. And that is to keep tension on it and keep it from going back into the body. Then they put on topical antibiotics so that the person doesn't get a secondary infection, and they bandage it every single time so that it's clean and just as we do normally here. They also give them pain medication because it's quite painful. And then it's just repeated every day until the worm has been fully removed. I saw something really interesting. I don't know if any of you have seen kind of the traditional symbol of medicine, where it's like a snake wrapped around a pole, but it's thought that it's actually the worms, or parasitic worms that were in people way, way long ago. This disease was eradicated in Greece in ancient history, but that worm wrapped around a stick is oddly similar to what they're doing right here. So I don't know if it's actually true, but I thought that was really interesting. Okay, so this disease is actually probably going to be the 2nd disease to be eradicated after smallpox. It's the first parasitic disease to be eradicated, and the first to be eradicated without a vaccine or medicine. And I think, as I said this before, that's really cool. It means that you can train people to go on the ground and do it, and you don't have to worry about having people come in from the outside. Yeah, and they are well on their way to eradicating it. There were only 25 cases reported in 2016, which is excellent. Yeah, and there was also an interesting note about new hosts and kind of lookalikes that confuse people who are studying the diseases, which you're welcome to look into more on your own time. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions on Monday. Have a great day.